Good morning, everyone.
Morning. Morning.
First day of autumn. Today is the day that the Earth is where we are is equal in day and night. So I hope everybody feels in perfect balance. So today I'm going to give a very short information about a particular Buddhist teacher, and then I'm going to give a short teaching on Anapanasati and hopefully make a connection between this teacher, who I'm going to introduce to you. His name is Bhikkhu Analayo. Bhikkhu Analayo is a German teacher who was born in 1962, and he went to Sri Lanka in 1995, and he has been very well known for his studies comparing the Buddhist suttas to the Chinese Agama. So let me, by way of explanation, give a little bit of background that of course, the Buddhist suttas written in Pali, written down during the first 100 years after the Buddha was alive and teaching, and these have become part of the three baskets of the suttas, which are the discourses, Vinaya, which is the stories about the code of conduct, and the Abhidhamma, which is the philosophical treatises, psychological understanding of the mind. So these were written in Pali, and then when the teachings went to China, there were a number of people who translated these suttas into Chinese, and Kathy has been giving a number of talks about some of the great translators, Pumajiva and others who were involved in the translation of the Buddhist teachings. So these teachings in the suttas, as they were written down in the Chinese, became known as the Agama. Now there is a difference between the terminology and even some of the sections in the Agama as compared to the original Pali Suttas, and we don't really know exactly whether part of the Pali Suttas were perhaps lost, or there were several versions of the suttas, or if the Chinese wanted to go into more depth in explaining certain things. So there's not a one-to-one correspondence. And of course, when you translate the Pali terms into Chinese, you have an interesting understanding of some of the terms that have been used. Because then when we get these words in English, we have our own English association with the meaning of these words. And so then that leads us perhaps sometimes into a better understanding of what the Buddha was talking about, but sometimes leads us a little bit astray because we're then dependent upon the understanding of what the translator meant. So uniquely, Bhikkhu Analayo, who was certainly brought up in the Theravadan tradition, has become very interested in the Chinese translations. His main teacher, actually, is Bhikkhu Bodhi. So so there's this very strong connection to the original teachings. And the person who is assisting Bhikkhu Analayo in his translations and understanding of the terms, I'll talk about in just a moment, but how I became familiar with Bhikkhu Analayo was in investigating the Satipatthana Sutta, looking at trying to understand mindfulness of mind and realizing that many of the texts on mindfulness of mind are limited in their explanation. And then going to Bhikkhu Analayo's book on the mindfulness, Four Foundations, realizing, oh my goodness, here is the person who is actually going into great depth and understanding of mindfulness of mind, and the way in which he does that incorporates the Chinese agama. So this was really very exciting to see this kind of excursion into unifying the suttas and the agamas. So this book, the Satipatthana, The Direct Path to Realization, is certainly available. It was published in 2003. So most recently, the Venerable Bhikkhu Analayo has been translating the Agama version of the connected discourses. It's the Mutta Nikaya. And so now he's translating the Agama version of this. And the first section of this has been released just this past month and is available online. Anyone who wants to look at it. The section that he has released is on the 5 aggregates. And so this is very exciting. And the person who is assisting him in this is none other than someone who is known to many of us here, Venerable Kong Mu, who's living in Taiwan, who I haven't heard from in the last couple of months, and now I know why. I'm very involved in this. So, as I was preparing this talk today, I thought, well, I could go over the teachings that Venerable Analayo has indicated in some of his texts, but really, much of what it is that the Buddha has asked us to do is to investigate things on our own. So I decided to use a little bit of Venerable Analayo's methodology to investigate on my own the Anapanasati Sutta, the mindfulness of breathing, which is very closely connected to the 4 foundations of mindfulness. And of course, those of us who practice here, and we understand that the focal point for our meditation practice is at its base observing, accepting, and letting go, using the breath as a focus. The Anapanasati Sutta is something that many of us are familiar with. But as I began to look at this using the methodology that has been inspired by Venerable Analayo, I looked at the sutta again and realized, my goodness, there's quite a bit more in this sutta than I had originally understood. So I'm going to read to you a little bit of the sutta so that we can look at it together, and we're going to pause in the middle of the sutta and look at the 16 parts, but not in terrible depth. We'll just look at it and see if we can have some understanding of it. So the sutta begins, thus I have heard that on one occasion the Blessed One was staying at Savatthi. Of course, this is the main retreat area for during the rains retreats. In the eastern monastery, the palace of Megrara's mother, together with many well-known disciples with Venerable Sariputta. Of course, we know Venerable Sariputta because of his closeness to the Buddha and how he appears in so many of the Mahayana texts as well. And then he lists a number of other of the disciples who were there and including Ananda and others. And some elder monks were teaching and instructing 10 monks, and some were teaching and instructing 20 monks, and some were teaching and instructing 30 monks, etc. And so the Buddha is noting this, and he says, now on that occasion, the Upasata day of the 15th, the full moon night of the Pavarana ceremony, the Blessed One was seated on the open air surrounded by the community of monks. So there are certain days, the first, on the full moon and the new moon, where there are certain days where the monastics would get together and practice. And the Buddha was was surveying the community of monks in the silent community, and he addressed them. He said, monks, I am content with this practice. I am content at heart with this practice. So arouse even more intense persistence for the attaining of the as yet unattained, the reaching of the as yet unreached, the realization of the as yet unrealized. I will remain right here at Savatthi for another month, through the white water abiding month, the 4th month of the rains. So he's staying, usually the rains retreats are 3 months, this time he's extending it for another month. The monks in the countryside heard the Blessed One, they say, will remain right here at Savatthi through the white water lily month, the 4th month of the rain. So they left for Savatthi to see the Blessed One. Then the other monks taught and instructed the new monks, etc., and was talking about the different monks. And the Buddha continues, so in this community of monks, there are monks who are arahats, whose mental effluence have ended, who have reached fulfillment, done the task, laid down the burden, attained the true goal, and laid waste to the fetters of becoming, and are released. So he now is saying that there are some among them who have attained this highest goal, the arahats. And then he says there are monks here who have attained the stage of non-returning. They're not quite at the state of arahat, but they have attained well. And then he goes on to say that there are those in the group who are once returners. And there are those in the group who are stream enterers, stream winners. In this community of monks, there are monks with the wasting away of the first 3 fetters. These are the stream enterers, steadfast, and again, destined to states where they can attain full awakening. And then there are those in the community. So he's kind of going in order from those who have had the highest attainment down to those who are having great attainment, but not the highest attainment. And then after the stream enterers, he gives a list of another group of monks that are there who are devoid of the development of the 4, who are devoted to the development of the 4 frames of reference. In this, the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the 4 right efforts, the 4 bases of power, etc. And he goes through a list all the way through explaining that these monks have penetrated and who are devoting themselves to the 37 factors of enlightenment. So we can see that the study of the 37 factors of enlightenment, which would include the 4 foundations of mindfulness, are what gives rise to the stream entry, which then gives rise to the once returners, the non-returners, and to the arahats. So we can see this development. But what is it that the people are practicing at the base before this, before the understanding of the 37 factors? He then gives another group of monks. These monks who remain devoted to the development of goodwill, compassion, appreciation, and equanimity. So these are the monks who are focused on what we would call the four boundless mind states of the immeasurables, the Brahma Vihara. So this is the development of loving kindness and compassion, altruistic joy and equanimity in another translation. So we can see the progression where the person begins to develop those qualities that then lead them to be able to have a better understanding of the 37 factors. But then there are those monks who are practicing even in the base of that to give them preparation for the understanding of loving kindness and compassion. And these monks are practicing, and they're devoted to the mindfulness of in and out breathing. So mindfulness of in and out breathing, when developed and pursued, is of great fruit, of great benefit. Mindfulness of in and out breathing, when developed and pursued, brings the four foundations of mindfulness to their culmination. The four frames of mindfulness, when developed and pursued, bring these 7 factors of awakening to their culmination. And the 7 factors for awakening, when developed and pursued, bring clear knowing and release to their culmination. So here we have, similarly into the last section of these 4 foundations of mindfulness, in which the 7 factors of enlightenment are also described, and the 4 noble truths, which then are the clear knowing and release. So we can see that there's a very strong connection between the mindfulness of the breath, leading all the way to the fruition and the release. So it appears as this, the Anapanasati Sutta, this mindfulness of breath, gives a very clear, short, concise understanding of the mindfulness of the breathing that leads to all of the development of these other levels. So, what is this mindfulness of in and out breathing? So, there is the case where the monk, having gone to the wilderness, to the shade of the tree, or to the empty building, sits down, folding his legs crosswise, holding his body erect, and setting mindfulness to the fore. Always mindful, he breathes in, mindful, he breathes out. So there begins the 16-part understanding of what happens during the mindfulness of the breath. So, in the spirit of Venerable Angalio, I have included a chart for you which gives the short version of each of the 16 parts, the Pali word, and also the Chinese. Let's see if we can glean from this a greater understanding so that when we sit in practice, our mindfulness of the breath does not wander off too much. Because when the mind is beginning to practice mindfulness of the breath, it is so easy for us to be distracted. We begin focusing on the breath, and then after a few moments, or even after a few breaths, or maybe even not that long, the mind wanders off and we start thinking about our body. We start thinking about all of the things, the dramas in our lives. We think about external events and how they're affecting us. All of these things interrupt, and then we have to bring ourselves back gently, without judgment, to the focus on the breath. So if we have a little bit of a deeper understanding of what's going on with the breath, perhaps this will give us some further focus, so that then eventually we can just rest with the rising and ceasing of the breath. So the first instruction that the Buddha gives has to do with to be able to accept the breath no matter how it's going. If it's long, it's long. If it's short, it's short. In the same way, we could extend this to if our breathing is fast, it's fast. If it's slow, it's slow. If it's deep, it's deep. If it's shallow, it's shallow. Just to be able to observe the breath and accept it just as it is sufficient. The next, sensitive to the entire body. Okay. So this has actually led to the scholars debating whether or not this refers to the body or to the breath, as if that's particularly important. So if we look at the Pali word, we see the word embedded here, kaya, K-A-Y-A. So sabha means all, kaya means the body, or the embodiment of something. And the next term means the sensitive to. So we have here that we're being sensitive to the entire body. But is it the entire body of the breath, or is it that we're making a connection between our breathing and our body? So there are a number of scholars who debate this point, but really, I think it's best to not get so caught up in the debate, but to remember that the word here is kaya, which means the body. And the breath and the body are interconnected. Every cell in our body is breathing. This is called, in science, cell respiration. So it's perfectly fine to consider this, that we're noticing our breath as it enters and engages with our entire body. In the Chinese, the word is breath. But I think that it's important to recognize that the breath and the body are interconnected. So then the fourth instruction is you will breathe calming the body. Again, the word kaya is prominent here. The Chinese use the word breath, but either way, not a problem. And this is connected to our subtle breath. The breath is actually the habit energy of the body. When we're not thinking about anything related to the breath, our breath continues. So it is a habit that the body has. Every cell has this habit energy of exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide. This is what our body does. If our body stops that, then this life has come to a close. So paying close attention to the fact that this is a bodily formation. The term formation or fabrication, it's what the body does. It's an automatic habit energy. So this is why we focus on the breath, because we want to become, as you'll see, more sensitive to that habit energy that we have, so that we can understand where our habit energy has become something that leads us away from being mindful. So we want to be mindful of our habit energy. Beginning with the breath helps us to see how our mind and body are mindful in this moment. That's what the breath does. It's in the moment. It's what our body is doing. Our body is in the moment. Only it's our mind that's untrained that goes wandering off. So then we're going to move on to the next section. You notice that I've shaded this a little bit because this is organized into 4 parts. Parts 5 through 8 have to do with feelings. So the first part has to do with the breath in the body. He trains himself sensitive to the feeling now of rapture. Now, rapture here, the word piti, is actually the third of the 5 jhana factors. It has to do with being able to have the mind fully engaged in the moment, where the mind, when it's fully engaged in the moment, has no desire for any other kind of pleasure, because the being in the moment is enough. So when we're in that moment, that joyfulness of just being in that moment is sufficient. You don't have to say, oh, I'm in this moment, but actually I'd rather be somewhere else. So the mind just stays focused in that moment. No other gratification is needed. So I will breathe sensitive in and out to this feeling. And then I will breathe in and out sensitive to the word pleasure, sukha. Sukha is the opposite of dukkha. Dukkha is suffering. Sukha is the feeling of being released from suffering. So it's not a sense-based pleasure. Sukha is being released from the distress of all of the ways in which the mind engages with our experience with a burden, with a distress. So then he trains himself sensitive to now the mental formations, the mental fabrications. Chitta is the word for mind, and Sankara is the word for formations. So here we have the mental formation that the mind is breathing in and out, noticing how the mind's tendency is. What is the habit energy of my mind now? What is it that it's wandering to? What kind of feelings arise when my mind wanders to this and wanders to that, instead of being right in the here and now? And then finally, I will breathe in, calming the mental formations. So I don't want to just be sensitive to them, I also want to calm them. I want to bring my mind back and just be with the breath and not go wandering off. So this is the second part of the 4 parts that relate to the 4 foundations of mindfulness that are found within Anapanasati. Now the next section has to do with the mindfulness of the mind, starting on page 9 on the back of your paper. I will breathe in sensitive to the mind, he says. So this is now the pure mind, the consciousness. In the Chinese, it means to wake up the mind, to be right here. He trains himself to breathe in, satisfying the mind. Causing the mind joyfully pleased is the Chinese. It means that the person is just satisfied again with being in the here and now, not having to wander off. In the first place, he wanders off for feelings. Here, wandering off for thoughts, not important. He doesn't have to chase any other thoughts. I will breathe in, steadying the mind, so the mind is able to remain stable. Single in its explanation, very clear, not complicated. Then, in the 12th part, I will breathe in, releasing the mind. So now the mind is able to let go, is able to let go of any further distress that might be in the mind. Now we come to the really important part, the last section, where he trains himself. I will breathe in, focusing on inconstancy, or wuchang, impermanence. Anicca is the Pali, wuchang is the Chinese. So this is the first of the three Dharma seals of impermanence, unsatisfactory nature, and no self. So here the person practices focusing on this sense of impermanence. Everything, always, not holding on to it, has to remain this way. So here begins the understanding of the external phenomenon. Not always do we have to say it's external, because the phenomenon is actually generated by the mind. What we experience is what our mind is connecting to, so it is always related to what the mind is generating. So when we touch to phenomenon, first, as we touch to it, remember, it is impermanent. Then the next, I will breathe in, focusing on dispassion. So in the Chinese, the word is guan, same term as in guanyin, contemplate. Really focusing on, really meditating, being in a state of awareness. And then the word is tan. Tan is greediness, wanting more of what you have. So this passion means don't want more than what you have. Be just in this moment, not seeking after any other sense pleasure. This tendency of the mind to seek after sense pleasure is that underlying habit energy that leads to distress and difficulty, because no matter how much you believe that the external world will give you happiness by getting more and more, there is no end to this. There's always more that you want, always something different. So just being content with what we have, being dispassionate, not attaching to it. Then he trains himself focusing on cessation. So the word cessation, nirodha, in the Pali, nirodha is one of the terms that is related to nirvana. It's the extinguishing of those strong desires that we have, those subtle desires that we have, letting go of all of that so that we can enter into a state of just releasing from the pain and suffering, being right in the moment. So, contemplating extinction in the Chinese. And then he trains himself, breathing, focusing on relinquishment. So even beyond the extinction, then relinquishment. Oh, so what is this relinquishment? This is the abandoning of seeking further after any goal. Once we've attained this state, we don't have to seek out or seek for anything else. So these are the 16 steps, the 16 stages in brief understanding. So this is how mindfulness in and out breath is developed and pursued so as to be of great fruit, of great benefit, the Buddha concludes. So then there is the relationship of this particular teaching to the four frames of reference that I've alluded to, the first four of the 16 being related to the body, the next four having to do with mindfulness of feeling, the next having to do with mindfulness of mind, and then of the mental qualities of phenomena. So then the final steps of the sutta have to do with how this relates to the 7 factors of awakening. This may be a topic for another talk, but just to make the connection that here there's a very strong realization that the last 4 of the 16 are related directly to the 7 factors of enlightenment. So I challenge you to do your own investigation to see how those are interconnected. And that how this leads to clear knowing and release. So I hope that this revisiting of the Anapanasati Sutta, as I have been inspired by Venerable Bhikkhu Analio and Venerable Kongmu and their studies, I hope that it will be of benefit to you as you sit this fall and focus on your breath, how that's connected to your body, to your feelings, to your mind, and to your understanding of your experiences. May all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all beings never be separated from the altruistic joy which is free from suffering. And may all beings dwell in the great equanimity which is free from attachment, aversion, and ignorance. And may our understanding of the 4 great mind states help us to make progress in the 37 factors